Good evening, everyone. Late Night Mega here, and tonight we're playing Grixis Superfriends. Now, I mentioned in the last video that this was designed as an anti-Tron deck, which meant main deck crumbled to dust. So how did we get from main decking crumbled to dust to Superfriends? Well, I'll get into that, but first I'll address the main issue of, well, what happens when you run main deck crumbled to dust? Well, obviously, it's going to be good against Tron, and it does have some interesting applications against other decks. You might think it's just going to be a complete dead card against other decks. Not necessarily. You know, any man lands that you see, Mutavault, Celestial Colonnade, etc., Crumble to Dust, main deck, not so bad against those. Another interesting one is people playing like Tezzeret, Agent of Bolas, and animating a Darksteel Citadel, which is indestructible. Crumble to Dust can get rid of that too, and then proceed to get rid of any other Darksteel Citadels that aren't already in play. So it has some interesting applications, but the idea that it's going to be dead against certain decks sometimes, that is a very real thing you have to consider when you're running what's typically a sideboard card in the main deck, especially as a 3-of. And so you're going to want ways to discard it out of your hand. Another interesting thing Crumble can do while I'm on that topic is against some decks, maybe you can cut them off of a color with Crumble to Dust, or cut them off of like double black or double red or something. If it's a type of deck that needs that, you can kind of screw with their mana sometimes randomly. So, like I said, interesting applications, but we're going to want ways to get this out of our hand should we be playing a deck that does not need it. And so I turn to like Jace, Vern's Prodigy, and Is It Charm. So Jace discards a card, so if we're playing against a deck where we don't need Crumble to Dust, well, we can get that out of our hand. And helps us flip Jace into Jace Telepath Unbound, so that's nice as well. And it's Grixis because, well, once you have Jace Vern's Prodigy, well, Snapcaster Mage is coming, it's a blue deck. You're going to want Kolaghan's Command. Those are pretty good with those creatures. So that's how we got to Grixis. And from there I'm just kind of like, well, what else do I put in this? Because this isn't really a finisher setup. And I'm like, well, let's go with kind of a Super Friends sort of theme. And so here we have some more Planeswalkers down here. Counting the 2 Jaces, we've got 6 total. We've got 2 Ashiok, a Chandra the Firebrand, which I'll talk more about in a little bit, and an Ob Nixilis. And yeah, I found this setup to be quite interesting. I've won a lot of games with the Ashiok. Ashiok was originally a 1-of, and Ob Nixilis Reignited, the emblem on that, has won me quite a fair number of games, more than what you'd expect. Another hilarious thing, since this is an anti-Tron deck, Ob Nixilis' emblem here is really hilarious against a Tron player when they have a bunch of chromatic stars and spheres that they're using to cycle. Now every time that they use one of those, they lose 2 life. And so that's something really amusing. So with all of this, clearly we had to cut some things. I used my Cruel Ultimatum deck as sort of a base template for this. You can see a lot of similarities in this deck. But clearly when we put in 3 Crumble to Dust, we're going to have to take out some of the creature removal. And so because of that, I added in 2 Anger of the Gods in the main deck, so we have some mass removal in the deck now as well. So that's another neat little thing I like about this deck. And once again, if you're in a matchup where Anger of the Gods isn't good, like Tron, you can discard it away. And I'm also running pretty much the same mana base as before, but I took out like one of the Drowned Catacombs and put in a Desolate Lighthouse, again for some additional filtering. So we've got 5 cards that can kind of filter. And I do like the Planeswalkers. I like the Super Friends. This is the first sort of like Super Friends-ish deck. I don't know if you want to count tokens or buffs Super Friends. It runs 3 Planeswalkers. This one runs 6. So, yeah. And I also added in a Worm Coil engine in place of the Grave Titan from Cruel Ultimatum, because you're going to want some way to regain life, especially with Ob Nixilis and fetch lands and such, and just any damage you take from your opponent. Other than that, the rest of the deck is pretty straightforward from the Cruel Ultimatum deck list. We have 4 Inquisition of Kozilek. Once again, I really like the early discard, and it's something else that we can pitch to one of our filter cards when we get later in the game and we don't need those. We have Lightning Bolts, we have Remands, we have Terminates, Kolaghan's Commands, Cryptic Commands, we have Snapcasters up there. One other thing I want to touch on, we have 2 Terminates and just 1 Dreadbore here. It was originally 3 Terminates, but I do like having the Dreadbore as a way to answer opposing Planeswalkers, since we're going to be tapping out more on our turn for like Ashiok or Chandra. You're going to want... I just found it was nice to have a way to deal with Planeswalkers. I don't regret having it. And plus, if you're using Jace's effect here to basically flashback something in your graveyard, you know, you're doing it as a sorcery anyways, so the sorcery to instant transition there, not as big. Other than that, yes, Chandra the Firebrand. So this was kind of a Planeswalker. The Planeswalker's goal was to kind of help mitigate some more creature removal. That's why I went with Ob Nixilis here. And Chandra can pick off like 1 toughness creatures and tokens, so that's why I went with her. And I do like this this version of Chandra, and I like the -2 effect. The -2 effect can get kind of interesting at times when you're, especially if you start like copying a Kolaghan's Command or copying a Cryptic Command, or in our sideboard, we'll just glance down here real quick, copying Slaughter Games. That's a fun card to copy, because 1 will resolve. You'll get to look through your opponent's hand and deck, and then the second one resolves, and then you name a card after ripping apart their hand and deck the first time. So if you see they have like multiple copies of something in their hand, you can name it with the second Slaughter Games. And I like that interaction, so I wanted that in there as well. And her ultimate isn't horrible. It's a nice burst of damage. A lot of games you're going to win by either Ashiok or by just doing some burn damage between Lightning Bolts, Kolaghan's Command, Chandra, and maybe an Ob Nixilis emblem. And so that's kind of the main deck. So let's go on to the sideboard. Now, since we're running 3 Crumbles and 2 Anger of the Gods in the main deck now, that gives us room in the sideboard to run 4 Dragon's Claw against a burn deck. And boy, is that really nice to have against a burn deck. So this Grixis deck does a bit better against that. And other than that, we have a lot of things that you've seen before in the Cruel Ultimatum deck. You've got the 1 Rakdos Charm and the 1 Nihil Spellbomb. You know, both of them can exile graveyards. Rakdos Charm can do it as an instant from your hand when your opponent's not expecting it, so you have that. And it can also destroy artifacts, so it's good against artifact decks as well. We got the 2 Dispel, we've got 2 Counterflux, Tribute to Hunger, Sacrifice Effect, and more life gain. And then the last couple slots, I took out the Keranos for another Planeswalker, Liliana Vess. I don't own Liliana of the Veil, so probably why you're not seeing that in here. But if you have that, you know, feel free to use that in your Grixis Superfriends as well. But Liliana, once again, it's a 5-mana card. Pretty good card to resolve against a control deck. You know, just make them discard every turn. And you can also tutor stuff with it. Tutor another Planeswalker, tutor whatever you need. I've used it to tutor a Worm Coil engine against a red-white sort of lockdown deck that was running was running like Ghostly Prison and Leyline of Sanctity. Leyline of Sanctity is, by the way, very bad for this deck, because a lot of the stuff that you would have targets your opponent, like Ob Nixilis's Emblem says target opponent, Chandra the Firebrand, target, Ashiok, target, Jace's ultimate here, you get an emblem that says you target your opponent, so them having a Leyline of Sanctity is pretty bad, and the way I ended up getting through that was playing Liliana, tutoring up Wormcoil Engine, and swinging with that. That was interesting. And Curse of Deathhold, this is kind of, I don't know if I want to call it a sweeper, but it's good against like Infect, Affinity, a lot of decks where you might want additional master removal tokens and things like that. So that's kind of the deck. Decks that this is good against, pretty much creature-based decks. You still have a lot of ways of dealing with creatures, and creature decks don't really like seeing an Ashiok across the table either. Decks that this is not so good against, Leyline of Sanctity, white decks, and sometimes combo decks can hurt you as well, because you're tapping out for a Planeswalker, or you're tapping a lot of your mana for a Planeswalker, leaving yourself open to whatever combo they might have. I mean, sure, you've got ways to mitigate that with Inquisitions. You can see their hands, see what's going on. But other than that, yeah, how does this do? The big question is, how does this do against Tron decks, since this was designed as an anti-Tron deck with 3 Crumble to Dust in the main deck? And I would say it does okay. I'd give it about a 7 or an 8 out of 10 against Tron. Maybe 7.5 will split the difference there. And so obviously Crumble to Dust, good against Tron. However, Tron decks nowadays are running like World Breakers and Ulamogs, and so if they get to 4 mana before you do, or in some cases if they have a star already on the field, they can crack that and they can have 7 mana and their green play the World Breaker on turn 3, and then just make it so you never get to 4 mana and can never play your Crumble to Dust. So that's why I'm giving it about a 7.5 out of 10 against Tron. But barring that Tron doing that sort of stuff, this deck is pretty well against Tron. Other things this deck loses to, it kind of loses to itself. Since there's no more Serum Visions, that's probably the biggest thing I dislike about this. No more Serum Visions, so you can't use Serum Visions to kind of filter your way out of an iffy starting hand. You end up relying a bit on Jace Vern's Prodigy and using his looting effect to sculpt your hand in the early turns, and so sometimes if Jace comes out and dies right away, that's kind of bad for you, because you were really counting on that draw discard effect just to kind of help shape your hand better. So the deck runs into that sort of issue as well. And I think to keep it Super Friends and keep the main deck Crumble to Dust, there's not... It didn't feel like there was a whole lot of choices for me. I didn't play this deck for too terribly long, just a few weeks, just to make sure, it does do what it was designed to do against Tron, and with that I was satisfied. And it was kind of fun playing it, playing some of these things that you don't see too much in Modern, especially these Planeswalkers here. Got a lot of interesting looks from players. They'd come over, see how my game is doing, because the game I'm at is always one of the most strangest things to watch, and they come over and they see multiple Planeswalkers on the board, including Chandra and Ob Nixilis, and they're like, what is going on over here? How did the board even get to this state? So that's the fun thing about playing the decks from here. You get a lot of weird stuff that happens in your games that probably does not happen a typical modern game. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about the deck. And you can switch up these Dragon's Claws in the sideboard. You can run other things as well. This was just an anti-burn spot, and I figured since we are playing red, this is going to trigger off of our own red spells, our own lightning bolts and Izzet Charms and Terminates, as well as all of our opponents. So that's why I opted for 4 Dragon Claws. I don't know. You can vary that up if you'd like. And Wormcoil over Batterskull, due to once again the Kolaghan's command. If you find other creatures you want to put in here, go for it. In fact, maybe you could even just take this deck, abandon these Planeswalkers, put in some other creatures to have more synergy with Kolaghan's command. That's an option too. I mean, there's nothing really tying these Super Friends together. This was just the route that I ended up taking when I made a deck with main deck crumbled to dust. So that's the deck. So now, teaser time for the next deck. We're in the post Oath of the Gatewatch metagame now, and that's why I started off with Oath of the Gatewatch by playing this sort of deck, playing main deck crumbles, because I'm like, Tron's gotten a lot of stuff, and there's people playing Tron, and I'm tired of losing to it. So next time, I've been teasing all along in this series about this trifecta of my most successful modern decks, and we've come across 2 of them already, the Cruel Ultimatum and the Blue-White Shadow of Doubt deck. The next deck is going to be the 3rd member of this trifecta, the 3rd member of this these decks, where I can just pick them up and take them to an event and be pretty sure that I'm going to place somewhere in the top 4 for prizes, getting like a 3-1 at an F&M or 4-1. Decks that I would feel comfortable taking to bigger events when those pop up as well. And so a little bit of a teaser for it. This is an archetype that I have avoided playing for quite a while, for reasons I'll get into next time. And it's an archetype that a lot of people have been expecting me to play for many months, or since I got into Modern, and I haven't played it, and they're like, why aren't you playing this? Well, I have my reasons. Another thing I'll tease about it is there was a card in one of the previous videos that I said, we will be seeing this card again, and that card will be in this deck. And so that's all I'm going to tease you with today. So this is Late Night Mega, and this is Grixis Super Friends. Good night, everyone.